Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm João Bosco Monte, the president of the Brazil-Africa Institute, and today I'm very pleased to have another webinar in a topic very important, the international trade, the challenges and actions after the pandemic. We are facing a very important problem nowadays in Brazil, in Latin America, in Asia, Europe, Africa, everywhere. And now I have the privilege and the honor to receive important guests to talk and to bring issues about the trade, the international trade. I'm here with Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the Commissioner for Trade and Industry for the African Union Commission. Ambassador Muchanga, thank you very much for your kindness, your participation, very, very much appreciated.
I'm happy to be here.
Very good. Also, I have the honor and the privilege to receive Mr. Yonov Frederick Aga, who is the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Mr. Aga, thank you very much. I know your agenda is very busy, so I'm very pleased to have you and your voice with us today.
Thank you very much.
And also, I have the privilege to receive a friend, Ambassador Rubens Recupero. He is the former Minister of Finance of Brazil. Ambassador, thank you very much to open your agenda to be with us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with so distinguished guests.
Very good. So I'd like to also give my thanks to the audience spread in many parts of the world. This program is broadcasted in our channel on YouTube, IBRAF, Brazil Africa Institute channel on YouTube. So feel free to send your comments, your questions to my guests. The international trade between different countries is an important factor in raising living standards, providing employment, and enabling consumers to enjoy a great variety of goods. I have a question to my guests to start this conversation, just to have an ice break. How do you see the global impact of trade because of the coronavirus? I start with you, Ambassador Albert Muchanga.
Well, thank you very much. And once again, I'm very, very happy to be here. I think the impact has been very, very adverse in all respects. If you look at the airline industry, which is part of international trade, or right now, as we are speaking, about 95% of the airlines are grounded because there's no market. And that also has a direct impact on the tourism. The tourist flows are declining. Merchandise trade is also going to suffer because the supply chains have been disrupted. And I think my brother here, who is from the World Trade Organization, will tell us that their projections are that in 2020, global trade is likely to decline anywhere between 13 to 32%, which is a major disruption. And when that happens, it means that the employment opportunities also dwindle. And when that happens, the livelihoods of the people are affected. And of course, in some cases, when there's a disruption of supply of food, even the lives are at threat. And of course, if also there's a disruption of medical supplies, the lives are at threat. And overall, the cost of international trade goes up. So really, the pandemic has disrupted us in very, very severe ways in the area of international trade.
Okay, you gave us some ideas, Ambassador Muchanga. I will come to you about something that you just mentioned, but now I'm bringing to you, Mr. Aga, this issue. How do you see the impact of global trade after the pandemic?
Well, I think as Ambassador Muchanga has already highlighted, the forecasts don't look good. And just to drive home the picture, let's assume the best case scenario of a 13% decline is what we get at the end of the pandemic. that will be twice as much as the bad effects of the 2008 financial crisis. If we get to 32%, that will be the worst to have happened since the 2008 and 1928 and 1929 crisis, which we all know led to the Great Depression and the consequences of war. So the challenge to the international community is the fact that this pandemic is just another layer of problems. Prior to the pandemic, we already had trade tensions, which had disrupted a lot of trade flows. So in the emerging environment, consumption patterns have been distorted, manufacturing capacity has dropped, and as Ambassador Muchanga highlighted, most of production networks now depend on value chains where raw materials, inputs move across borders. And with the restrictions in place, this has become very devastating, particularly for small economies. For those small economies, like we take the case of Ethiopia in Africa, that seem to have been just getting itself into these value chains, it's devastating. And the worst part of it is that in Africa, many of the countries are dependent on maybe one commodity or two, and with very few markets. So the stress in major importing markets like China and the US also means a loss in their system. So in their participation in trade, the gains they may have made have now been wiped out. So I think what we need to look at now would be, how do national governments cooperating together, working with international institutions, begin to respond or begin to prepare so that they can have a good resurgence in the post-COVID-19 period.
All right. Frederick, you mentioned something very important about the role at the end of your statement, the role of the national government in cooperation with the international society. So I will raise this back when we come back to you. Now, Ambassador Recupero, you've been Minister of Finance of Brazil, so you are in the international arena. How do you see the global trade impact after the coronavirus in Brazil, but also in some other parts of the world? Please, what's your take?
Well, let me say not so much from the perspective of having been Minister of Finance of Brazil, but I also spent almost 10 years as Secretary General of UNCTAD in Geneva. So I dealt with international trade issues for a long time. Even before that, I had been for 4 years the Brazilian ambassador at GATT, where I had several different posts. So, using this perspective of international trade, what we just heard from my two colleagues, I think has covered very well practically the most important things that you could say about the global outlook. It's really gloomy, difficult. We know that not only production, GDP, will be very strongly hit, but also trade in many different areas. Perhaps what should be also highlighted in this moment is that the impact will not be equal to all areas and to all countries. It would be wise also to see the differences. For instance, there is no doubt that some sectors will be particularly affected. Ambassador Muchanga had already pointed out the case of airlines, air travel. And we can see that this area of travel, of tourism in general, of a restaurant, hotels, hospitality in general, will suffer very much. Because even after the pandemic is over, it is likely that people will take longer to resume their habits. And there are many, many countries where tourism accounts for 12% of employment or even more, like in Greece, in the Caribbean countries. So, for those countries, I think we should prepare some kind of a different approach. I also think that an area that will suffer very much is already suffering is oil. But oil, as was pointed out here, is not only the problem of the slump in oil prices, is not only the result of the pandemic. We know that it was more or less simultaneous, but there was this famous move by Saudi Arabia, the problems with Russia, that has produced great turmoil in the market. So we would need not only to fight the pandemic, but also this lack of cooperation among oil producing countries to try to recover. In some other areas, I would say, and this applies to Brazil and to some countries in Latin America, the impact so far in terms of commodity exports has been diversified. Brazil was hit in terms of oil sales and to some extent, but not so much, in iron ore. But in other areas, for instance, the most important aspects of Brazilian foreign trade are now concentrate on food exports, basically soybeans, beef, poultry, pork. In those areas, we haven't seen much change. There was some difference in prices, there was some drop to the European Union, but we had a sort of a compensation. For instance, from January to May, our exports to China have grown. Actually, they have grown, not been reduced by 16%. In the month of May, China accounted for 40%, 40% of the total sales of Brazil. And taking China and the Asian countries together, they have been the responsible for a relatively reasonable behavior. That is, Brazil is suffering. Exports
Ambassador.
are down, but not so much as people had feared.
All right. We should come back to this bilateral trade later. We have now some people participation from many parts. We have from Zambia, Ambassador Mchanga. We have from Nigeria, Frederick. We have also from South Africa, from Ethiopia, from Brazil, of course, Ambassador Rubens Recupero, and from Ghana. And I have the privilege to have with us Ambassador Abena Buzia, who is the ambassador of Ghana in Brazil. So thanks, Ambassador, for your participation. I have a question that could be addressed both to you and Albert. Both of you mentioned something very important that we can combine it. You mentioned, Frederick, about the national government, how the national government can adjust and also interact with the international organizations and international business. And also, Ambassador Muchanga, you mentioned the difficulties, for instance, for the airline industry, for the tourism. So we have some countries that are very concentrated in one specific area. Tourism, for instance, if you go to Egypt or South Africa, tourism is very important. Without tourism, the economy of these countries will not be good enough to move. So very quickly, how the World Trade Organization is helping national governments to be ready when the pandemic is over. And also how the African Union Commission is dealing within Africa. We have 54 countries to be ready when the COVID-19 is not the reality. Please. I start with you, Frederick.
Well, thank you. I think there are basically three perspectives. First is conceptual. Trade is important for growth. Trade is important for economic recovery. And based on the overall impact of COVID-19 on national economies, everybody, every country would need a good trade regime to recover faster than they would have otherwise done. At the WTO, what we have been trying to do is to track COVID-19 measures that are being undertaken by governments. So you have on our website those measures that are trade restrictive, which is not bad because the WTO agreements allow members, for instance, to take measures to safeguard the public health and welfare of their people. On the same time, some aspects allow members to take measures to allow export restrictions to ensure availability of essential commodities. But if you look at the trade liberalization measures or facilitating measures that members have taken, they have allowed increased trade in medicines and pharmaceuticals. So the picture from a development point of view is not gloomy. This is also, the pandemic is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Africa because if we look around the world, most of trade is done in terms of global value chains. But unfortunately, global value chains are not global, they are regional. So African countries can now begin to look at sourcing closer and selling closer than sourcing abroad and selling abroad. So that becomes an opportunity. The next element is, I think, the fact that COVID-19 has forced everybody online, whether in terms of the selling, how we do business. So in Africa, the questions of internet connectivity, broadband and things like that becomes key. So investment in regulatory regimes, investment in how to have the right policies for consumer protection become key. So these are opportunities, this can be turned into opportunities rather than looking at the gloomy side. So I think the coming into place of the African Continental Free Trade Area is a good stepping stone. And with Ambassador Muchanga here, we want to plead that we don't allow this to go the way of the Lagos Plan of Action or the Abuja Treaty establishing the African Economic Community. In spite of the present challenges, please keep the leg on the throttle and allow the momentum for the takeoff of the Continental Free Trade Area to proceed, because it will help African countries in recovering from the devastating effects of the pandemic.
All right, Fred, you mentioned something very unique. Now we are in different parts of the world. I'm in Brazil. Ambassador Rubens Recupero also, he is in Brazil, and you are in Geneva. and Albert Muchanga is in Addis Ababa, and we are using the internet, and we are learning now how to use these devices and the technology to be live. So we are reaching people in many parts of the world this moment. And now I am addressing to you, Ambassador Muchanga, and Mr. Agahi mentioned something about the African Continental Free Trade area, that you are very, very excited and you are very busy in this agenda. I'd like to use this statement of Mr. Aga about the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And what's your take at the African Union Commission, but also continentally? How do you see the needs to engage with national market to avoid problems when the pandemic it's gone?
Thank you very much. The national markets have not served the Africa very, very well. They are very small, and because they are very small, it's very difficult to come up with a program of robust economic diversification. And because they are very small, they are regionally and globally uncompetitive. When we aggregate the 55 African countries into one market, we have a population of 1.27 billion people. And that is the third largest market after China and India. So the future of Africa post-COVID-19 lies in making sure that we operate the African Continental Free Trade Area. And my brother Aga used the word, which is actually the middle name of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the word is momentum. We need to give it continued dynamism so that it delivers to the expectations of African people. And the starting point is to ensure that Africans start increasing trade in the value-added products. And this is where manufacturing and agro-processing come in. The world today, one of the biggest areas of expenditure is around the manufactured products. So we have to move in that area. And in addition to that, the commodity markets have virtually collapsed, with the exception of gold. So we needed to add value to the commodities that are around Africa. And already some business people from other parts of Africa are looking for areas where they can source the inputs. And as part of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we started trying to produce some of the medical supplies within Africa. And using the Pan-African Manufacturers Association, we are able to link business people so that they get those supplies. So it's one area where we are not going to lose momentum. Beginning on the 16th, we are going virtually to start work on finalizing the phase 1 negotiations. These are on rules of origin, tariff concessions, and the trading services. And when we have finalized those, then we'll be able to convene the summit of the heads of state and government, and then immediately they've approved those. We should be able to roll out to the market. But the key issue is to mobilize the private sector to start investing in readiness for this market, because there's a difference in rolling out to the market and also ensuring that when it's rolled out, there are actually goods which should be used for trading, and that's where credibility comes in. So it's a very, very important undertaking, and it's a historical opportunity for Africa to end the era of small and competitive market and come up with one big market which can attract both small-scale and large-scale investments.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Muchanga, for your take. I come to you, Ambassador Recupero. Ambassador Muchanga mentioned at the end the role of the private sector, and I think the private sector could be very, very well engaged in to bring some solutions. How do you see the industrialization of the world? So countries cannot be stocked in the sales of commodities. We need to add value to the products when we could come to the market. How do you see the role of the private sector, Ambassador Rubens Recupero, and how the industrialization can be a reality in small countries, like countries in Latin America and also in Africa.
Well, like my two colleagues just said, this pandemic, in some sort of way, may provide an opportunity, particularly because of this disruption in regional, so-called global chains, because as Director Aga rightly pointed out, those chains are mostly Asian, now at least in terms of equipment for hospitals and pharmaceuticals, many countries in the world are thinking of reducing their dependence on those chains, and these may provide some opportunities, not for a retrocession in globalization, but at least a redistribution, exactly the possibility of having chains that are more global in nature. I think what Commissioner Machanga said that is taking place in Africa is also taking place in many other countries, in Brazil as well, because we suffered a great deal at the beginning with too much dependence on China. We could not get the equipment that we needed. So now there will be a trend toward some degree of less dependence. Of course, it has to be managed carefully because we are not supporting the idea that we should go back to a sort of a national autarky. That is not the idea. But particularly in the areas where we have a competitive advantages, we should try to improve the degree, the level of a value added, because this is the case, for instance, with most of the commodities that developing countries export. It is the case of oil, but it's also the case of minerals in general. It is the case of food. You know, it is some sort of a paradox that Germany remains the country that exported most industrialized coffee, industrialized tea, industrialized topics that come from tropical countries, because they have this capacity to add technology to the products and to sell the industrial goods. In our case, for instance, we have been trying to go up the ladder, particularly in the food industry. But it's not easy because, as my dear colleague Mr. Aga knows very well, there is still in world trade rules a punishment as you go up in the level of incorporating labor, because you know it's the so-called issue of the differential in tariffs between raw materials and the industrialized goods that are produced from those raw materials, the so-called tariff escalation. Tariff escalation has been an issue in trade negotiations for ages. It was discussed in the Tokyo round. It was widely discussed in the Uruguay round, but until now we have had very small results. Even today, you know, countries in the European Union or in other developed countries, they have a zero tariff for coffee, for cocoa, for most of what we export, But if you try to sell soluble coffee, you have to pay sometimes a very high tariff. So there is still ample roof for further negotiations because the reason I bring up this point is that sometimes you get the impression from the prevailing discussions that there is no anything more left for negotiations because everything significant has already been liberalized. And we know it's not true. There are still tariff peaks, and there is still much tariff escalation,
All right.
particularly in areas that are harmful for developing countries. So I would say in the recovery, we should ask our partners in the developed world also to make their contribution.
Um, okay, Fred, I was raising a question to you, but you can use the floor now. So I come to you later. Your
Maybe
mic is on.
you raise your question, then I'll take it along
uh,
with the follow-up I wanted to do.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to address a simple question. If you go to weak economies, countries where the economies relies in the commodities or raw material, as Ambassador Hikupu mentioned. If you go, for example, to Guinea-Bissau, 90% of the economy is in the production of cashew nuts, but there is no industrialization. How do you see the possibility to bring the attention of the private sector to change the situation in countries like Guinea-Bissau to produce, to industrialize, and to add value to the production of cashew nuts, and also the economy will be more strong?
Well, thank you. I wanted to follow up on the point of tariff escalation, tariff peaks, which have remained an important barrier to international trade. And I thought that this is more the reason why African countries that are just launching their continental free trade area and many other developing countries need the multilateral trading system and the WTO. So I'm not saying this as a commercial for the WTO, but I'm saying it as a matter of absolute necessity. You need strengthened rules that will provide you with the predictability to begin to put in place those policies that will contribute to your growth. And as we all know, trade policy is not a silver bullet. Trade policy must be designed by a country based on its own special circumstances, the resource endowments, the legal framework, your geography, your all kinds of things that go into it. So if you take the case of cashew nuts, a country can no longer use what you call comparative advantage. Trade policy today is about competitiveness. And trade policy today is not about let the private sector do it. No. Trade policy today is about a proactive government that intervenes in the market in a market-friendly manner. So it's not every government intervention that distorts market. If a government intervenes by maybe subscribing to shares of core companies, putting the companies on the stock market, you can start an industry that you never had. A country like Guinea-Bissau, that I think it was Guinea-Bissau that you mentioned, could equally become an aerospace outfit if that is the desire of the government, producing components that can be sold to Brazil to produce its aircrafts that can be sold around the world. It can go into chips manufacture that feed into information and communication technology equipment. So it's what you decide. And I like giving the example of Korea. Any of us that has gone to Korea, apart from the paddy rice, they have nothing. But deliberate industrial policy by governments have turned Korea that imports coking coal, the coal itself, the iron ore, into a leading exporter of steel and steel-related products like cars and others, and even trains. And then you come to my country, Nigeria, where you have the coal, the iron ore in one location, and we can produce a ton of steel. So these are things that we need to begin to reflect. In the past, we thought government was bad in business, but the business of government should be business. Where do you want to go? You invest. And the government investment should now become like the invisible hand that directs private sector investment into that sector in a timely, sequenced manner. It's not haphazard, but you must first lay a path, do the measures, sequence them so that they are complementary and they work together. So this is my own view. And I think if you look at what is happening around the world today, if we learned a lesson from the financial crisis, when most of the developed countries took shares in a bank like the Royal Bank of Scotland to rescue it, and the government moved out. You saw the same thing in the US. In the current environment, you see governments paying salaries of workers to allow those companies to not lay off their staff. But as soon as the pandemic goes, the staff will return, the companies will pay back these loans. So government intervention is not bad if it is market friendly. And African countries and other developing countries must begin to appreciate that we can produce good economic growth with government intervention rather than withholding our government support and then allowing economic decline and decay, which is where we have been now.
So very good, Mr. Aga, your intervention. And this is something that I now approach to Ambassador Muchanga. And in your last participation, you raised the very important efforts that we are doing, although we are now facing this situation. People cannot gather, people cannot be together, but looks like you are working too much, very much. You are the only one who is wearing ties, so you are working more than us. We are kind of relaxed, so you are working too much. So you mentioned something before that I'm now coming to Frederick, the private sector. How is the African Union Commission and this free trade agreement area will be able to approach to the private sector to give incentives for companies to come to Africa to produce and to be able to change the situation from a raw material producer to produce of goods? How do you see this as a potential? But also, I would like to address, because I have a question here that comes from Brazil. How is the possibility of using markets as Brazilian market to approach to the African continent?
Thank you very much. Let me start by talking about my tie. Because of the pandemic, schools have been closed all over the world. Now, homeschooling is the new normal, if I may use that word. And one of my daughters was telling me that she had problems with her two children to concentrate in learning. So I said, the solution is that we get them school desks, which we did, and they wear school uniforms early in the morning until 17 and 13 hours when they knock off. And since I'm punishing my grandchildren to wear school uniform, I'm also punishing myself to be formal at all times. So I have to be very, very fair to the children. Now, the issue of the private sector and the value addition is very, very important. I think the reality for African countries is that, like I indicated, the raw material exports are always zero rated. And therefore, if we wanted to trade in Africa, we have to add value to those raw materials. Otherwise, we'll be getting nothing, just as we are getting virtually nothing when we are exporting to the rest of the world. So the process of adding value means that you go into manufacturing or agro-processing. And in the past, a lot of African countries had difficulties in attracting major investors because the key issue was that your market is too small. Even if we invest, we'll not be able to recoup our investments because your market is very, very small. And that's the idea behind the African Continental Free Trade Area. You are aggregating all the economies to have a large market of 1.27 billion people. And when that is done, you are now bringing into play large economies of scale and large economies of scope. So it means it becomes very attractive to the private sector to invest in there. And as a result of this, we have had several engagements with the private sector. We've created a platform which we call the African Continental Free Trade Area Business Forum, where we bring in the private sector from within Africa and outside Africa. And one of the issues which has been on the agenda is how to develop regional value chains in the automotive industry. And quite a number of companies, especially those from Germany, are interested in there. And within Africa itself, we have engaged the private sector through the Association of Pharmaceuticals Industries as a response to COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Pan-African Manufacturers Association, which is going to engage in manufacturing. So we are in regular contact with the private sector. And immediately we started this process of engagement, some of them were saying the OAU and the African Union were created a long time ago. But like one of them around 2018 says, this is the first time as a business person, African business person, that I'm coming to the African Union. And when I was leaving my country, people were saying, what business do you have with the African Union Commission? And they said, well, I'm going to do business with them. And we discussed the business. They are very, 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 very happy. So the private sector is coming up because they see a large market, which is very, very attractive. And there are huge opportunities for adding value. And to assist them, right now, work is underway to come up with a regional value chain mapping exercise so that across the entire African continent, we'll be able to know what exists in which African country and how we can exploit those to promote intra-African trade. Thank you.
Thanks, Ambassador Muchanga. I'll come back to you, and thanks for your explanation about the tie. It's a good punishment. Ambassador Recupero, we are in Brazil, and if you look back to Brazil 40 or 30 years ago, Brazil moved from the position of an importer of commodities, agricultural commodities, and Brazil is a big producer and exporter of food, right? And I think Ambassador Muchanga and also Mr. Aga, both of you mentioned the agro-processing industry. What recipe you can see as ambassador, as a diplomat, but also someone who's related to the economy of Brazil? How do you see the move that we can have from importer to producer of food? Because food is very important for us to put in this discussion. Remember, we are in a crisis of health crisis, but also we have a food crisis that is coming very soon if we do not act properly. What's your take, Ambassador Recupero?
Well, let me talk a little bit about my personal experience. I'm already 83 years old, so I can remember the time when I was still a young man, when Brazil was totally dependent on only three commodities: coffee, cocoa, and sugar. We used to say that our problem was that Brazil only exported dessert products, whereas our neighbors, the Argentinians, would export wheat, maize, beef, products that are really essential. So in times of a crisis, people cut the dessert, but they have to eat. They have to eat beef and all the other products. Now this situation has completely changed. I mentioned here that when I was still 18 years old, Brazil was relying on coffee for 73% of its export earnings. Now coffee represents less than 4%, perhaps not even that much. What has been the factors that made this change possible? I would say three factors. One, as the director Aga said, there was a very strong action by the government in the 1970s, but in the market friendly manner. That is, first of all, the government put together a first class company for agricultural research, EMBRAPA, organized according to the private sector, but it is a public company. Bringing back to Brazil all the Brazilians that were teaching in the US and in other universities who were PhDs in agriculture and didn't find in Brazil a suitable environment. The government provided good wages, good salaries, good conditions for laboratory research, and they came back. So it was a combination of state action, secondly, of a scientific research, because at that time, most of the land that now is used to produce soybeans and maize, the Cerrado in Brazil, was like the African savanna, was considered unsuitable for agriculture. We got the help of the Japanese. They gave us much support because they were interested in having a sure source of soybeans besides the US. So they invest strongly in agriculture in Brazil. So this combination of strong market friendly state action, research in agriculture, and thirdly, the provision of access to cheap land through investing in infrastructure. Because at that time, all the regions that now are the more important sources of agriculture exports in Brazil, like Mato Grosso, were so distant from the seaports that they were almost useless. Land was very cheap. It was the government that built the basic infrastructure that made possible to bring the products to the ports. So I would say it was a combination. Let me say that I think that now and in the future, the most promising area for cooperation between Brazil and Africa would be in providing the Africans with the tools to develop their enormous potential for food production. There are in Africa enormous quantities of land in savanna kind, like Brazil. We have the same ecology, we are in the same kind of latitude, we have the same kind of rainfalls. So that could provide Africa with an enormous potential. There are areas like Ethiopia, for instance, where there are very, very good land to be developed, also in Mozambique, in other areas. So I think in this sector, is where I see the most promising possibilities of a cooperation between Africa and Brazil?
Very good, Ambassador. You mentioned something that I was about to raise at the Brazil Africa Institute, Mr. Aga. We have one program that we call YTTP, which means Youth Technical Training Program. Every year, we bring young Africans to Brazil to receive training in areas that Brazil is doing well. So when they come back home after stay here in Brazil for 1 month, 2 months maybe, they are more able to deploy the knowledge that they received in Brazil. And we started this program 3 years ago. And you mentioned EMBRAP, Ambassador Recupero, and we have a collaboration, a partnership with EMBRAP. So the kids from Africa, they come and they stay at the EMBRAP facility. And we had one experience on the cassava value chain very recently. And I come to you now, Director Aga, and also to you, Ambassador Muchanga. Both of you, you are Africans. You have this combination of efforts, and I know that you know the possibility of engagement with Brazil. But not only on with Brazil, how do you see the international cooperation aspect important to solve problems after the COVID or during the COVID? Remember, this topic that we are talking now is because of the pandemic. So when the pandemic it's over, how people will work and they will live, but how do you see bringing this example that I brought to you from Brazil, from EMBRAP, from our own experience? How do you see the role of international cooperation? I start with you, Ambassador Muchanga.
Thank you very much. International cooperation is very, very important. But before I go to that, let me indicate that I've got very fond memories of Brazil. I lived there as an ambassador for 3 years, and I traveled around the country, and I saw the possibilities and the transformation that is going on, and the role that EMBRAP is doing really to promote agricultural transformation. In Africa, we have cassava. And in Brazil, you find it in the mainline supermarkets. And some of the products from cassava even served in the top-notch hotels, which is value addition. Other than that, one of the common products around Africa is maize. In Brazil, I was able to eat cakes made out of maize. So this is the good work of EMBRAP. International cooperation is vital. Without it, I think, and let me indicate that it will be impossible to go to autarky. The countries have to learn to live together because they are tied together. So with that in mind, we need to ensure that really we develop a spirit of international cooperation where we are interdependent and we have a perspective that we either swim together or we sink together. But the environment now is not very, very conducive. No. Quite a number of countries are retreating from the multilateral trading system. They are driven by sentiments of economic nationalism. So we need really to ensure that we rein in that. We need to promote a spirit of interdependence. And even as we look at the pandemic as it is, no country on its own can solve this pandemic. We need elements of international cooperation, the supply chains, and beyond that, in the future, I think some of these medical supplies, we can really try to use mechanisms of international cooperation to ensure that we build the stockpiles of some of these medical supplies so that if we have a similar attack in the future, the world can really respond both at the international level and the regional level. So it's our task now to really promote a spirit of international cooperation. And Africa has indicated its readiness and willingness to go towards the international cooperation on multilateralism. And the basis of that is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So we will participate in the World Trade Organization with that spirit and to show our strong commitment. My brother Aga there is very much aware. Last year, we lodged in, not for the first time, an application for the African Union to have observer status in the World Trade Organization, because we have faith in that organization, and we believe that if we work through the world trading, the multilateral trading system, we should be able to really reduce the tensions that are existing and create an environment where we can use competition to ensure that we develop the global community. So interdependence is very vital. Without it, I think there will be reducing levels of economic growth in every part of the world. No country on its own can say, I'm self-sustained. No, there's no self-sufficiency. It can be collective self-sufficiency, like we are doing under the African Continental Free Trade Area. But there's no country that's going to say, I'll cross all the borders and be on my own. The people there in that community are going to face higher prices, and there will be political and social tensions in that country. So the route is international cooperation. Thank you.
All right, Ambassador Muchanga, please be there because I will come back to you. My brother Fred, now is your take, but include something that Ambassador Muchanga mentioned. He said that
I agree with him, but I also differ from him.
Okay.
For me,
Go ahead.
international cooperation, whether multilateral, bilateral, whatever, intergovernmental, is important. It's essential, but it is not the sufficient condition. You must, as a country, as a region, have your vision and pathway to growth. If you properly do it, develop that framework, then international cooperation becomes useful to you. Take, for instance, some of the discussions we've been having. You brought some young Africans into your institute. You train them. You send them back to Africa. First, in their individual countries and local communities, does the environment, government policy, business environment, does it favor their operations? My answer often will be no. If you, for instance, go to the WTO and negotiate an agreement that gives you duty-free, quota-free access, can you produce? If you can't produce, then that duty-free, quota-free is useless. And this is the challenge that Africa has faced as a continent. Every decade, we have a new policy framework, starting from cooperation in the 70s to regional integration in the 70s, structural adjustment in the 80s, and now we're talking about defragmenting Africa and bringing everybody together. No continent, no country will grow if your policy framework is changing every 10 years. So let's go back to Africa. You have already said the Africa you want, 2063. So sectorally begin to develop pathways, energy. If you need industrial development at this stage, what amount of energy do you need? If you need to develop steel sector, fertilizer, chemical sector, what kind of skills do you need? So it begins to feed into education. If you are having all this, what will be the impact on the environment? So it begins to feed into your regional environmental policy. It begins to feed into your health policy. So when you collaborate with Brazil, there's buy-in and relevance. The other aspect, which I had talked about before, is the role of the private sector. A lot of the things that you succeeded in doing in Brazil is because you kept to one policy. In Africa, each time there's a crisis, we go on the demand side. I can tell you 3/4 of African governments in the face of this current pandemic are cutting their budgets when they should be investing more. So by the time you get out of the pandemic and you have cut all your budget, you have stopped planned investments. It's a setback. So these are things that I thought for international cooperation, international assistance to help you, you must also prepare yourself to receive that assistance in your areas of need, in areas that add value to the attainment of your growth objectives. So I agree with my brother Ambassador Muchanga, but I think in the absence of a national policy framework that is coherent and reinforcing, international cooperation may remain just a mirage.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Aga, Director Aga, for your take. And this is the beauty of this kind of activity. We have people who agrees, people who doesn't agree too much. So that's the reality. And I know, Director Aga, some leaders are listening to us, and maybe your message will come into the heart and the mind of people within Africa and even in Brazil as well. I'm very sorry to say that I'm receiving a message now that we are just about time to end. I'd like to also mention that we have brothers from Angola, from India, from Portugal, from Nigeria, again, from Ethiopia. So thank you very much for your participation in many parts of the world. But before we close, I give 2 minutes for each of you to address a direct message. Let's pretend that we have now 2 minutes to give a message that will solve the problem for the pandemic, right? So and using the trade as a tool, how do you address the message that trade is essential to save both lives and livelihoods around the world? So 2 minutes. I start with you, Ambassador Recupero.
Well, what Director Aga said is quite right. The experience of many developing countries has been, unfortunately, not constant over the time in terms of strategy. This is true about Africa, but it is also true about Latin America. But it is a learning process. I'm not pessimistic about the future to get this right combination between effective national policies and good regional and international cooperation. Right now, we have been seeing that the pandemics has not given place to a very high level of multilateral cooperation. But we should come out of this crisis at least with one lesson. We should try to provide the world with better global governance in fighting pandemics, to try to create an institution or to give the World Health Organization the means in the future to detect pandemics at an early stage and to be able to prevent it from spreading. At least in that sense, I think this lesson should be taken very seriously by everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Recupero, for your last words. And I remember 4 weeks ago receiving these webinars, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and he mentioned the word preparedness. The world should be prepared for the pandemic, for the moment that we're facing now. I'm coming to you, Director Aga. Please, you have 2 minutes to address a recipe, a message to someone who is listening to us. How trade is essential to save both lives and livelihoods. Please.
Well, I think my message will be in 3 parts. Trade for growth. So, trade for growth is, what are you doing now? And how can you do it better? Where are the markets and opportunities which is what you are not doing at all. So maybe you are not producing motor cars or motor car components. In some countries in Africa, they have good leather, so you can do car seats. So who is buying car seats? What technology are they using? What's the size of the market? This will help you determine the quality to meet those markets. So you can equally invest both policy, testing standards, and your bilateral negotiation or multilateral negotiation to get car seats produced. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's something that each country must look at itself, develop its priorities, and move on. We cannot any longer behave in the normal occurrence of things. The sun will rise, the sun will set. I come from a place where there is so many rivers, and yet we do not exploit dry season cultivation, which can then sell fresh fruits and vegetables to Europe or anywhere in the world which is under winter and you can't even grow. So these are the little things that countries and regions can think. Think of where you are, what you can do better, and what you can do, and then organize your production, supply chain to the market. And this is country by country, sector by sector. And I think with that, we will come out of this pandemic with lessons on how to do things better.
Thank you, my dear brother Fred. You mentioned the word lessons. You need to listen the voices of people like yourself and our colleagues to see what lessons we can learn. Ambassador Albert Muchanga, as you've been in Brazil for a long time, and also you know the reality now in Africa, how do you see the trade as essential to save both lives and livelihoods?
Thank you very much. Before I come to that briefly to say, I totally agree with my brother, Ambassador, that for one to be strong at home, for one to be strong at abroad, you need to be strong at home. It's one of my favorite sayings. There's no way you can negotiate effectively if your house is not in order or is not strong, because you don't have leverage. Trade is very important. And I can give a number of examples from past years. Almost in every home around the world, you've got potatoes because of trade. You've got beef because of trade. You've got rice, you've got because of trade. You've got good clothing, you've got vehicles, whatever, because of trade. So trade is very, very essential for connecting people together and also bringing improving the quality of life of people. So we need to invest in ensuring that we sustain the process of trading among countries throughout the world, because it is very good for improved livelihoods. Without it, I think we'll go back into autarky and the reduced levels of economic and social development. But when we come together to exchange goods in the international marketplace, then we are able to really ensure that we have win-win outcomes out of that process. It may not always be win-win outcomes, but at the end of the day, there are some benefits which come out of the process of trading. So as we go towards the COVID-19 post-COVID-19 era, I think one of the reality is that if there was complete breakdown in international trade, quite a number of countries, especially those in Africa, would not have been able to get the medical supplies that we got. But we are able to open corridors to ensure that these products were able to flow across Africa, and the international trade is saved the day. And as we go now towards the era after this pandemic, again, for countries to rapidly recover and grow and they come up with the very good defense mechanisms which are going to establish the resilience, international trade is very, very, very important. So let's have faith in international trade. Let's have faith in the multilateral trading system. It's what is going to make the world better. Thank you.
Very good. I'm so pleased to listen your voices, but I'm so sorry to say that our time it's over. I'd like to once again thank you, all of you, Ambassador Albert Muchanga, for your kindness, your participation. It was very good to listen your voice again. So thank you very much. You have my appreciation. Mr. Ionov Aga, thank you very much for your participation. It was good to listen your voice and to hear from the World Trade Organization perspective what this pandemic can be faced. Also, Ambassador Rubens Recupero, you are 83 as you mentioned, but it looks like you are younger than that. So thank you very much for your participation. It was a very good contribution. Also, I thank the audience. We have people from many parts of the world. It's very good, and this program was broadcasted on your channel on YouTube. It will be available. You can go as you want to see again. You want to review. So please feel free. In my personal name and the name of the Brazil Africa Institute, I'm very pleased and thank you for your participation and look forward to see you again in one of our next activities at the Brazil Africa Institute. Thank you.